Checking up on Grant. Just trying to get any inside information. Yeah.
Oh,
You can get a little bit higher.
Say it.
Well, I'm the Director of the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and I'm acting as chair on behalf of Secretary Boyles. Hopefully be able to join us in a little bit, but ask us to go ahead and get started. A couple of housekeeping items. One, this is being live streamed. Be aware of that. We've got a couple of folks that are joining us online. Two, the screens are over there. So if you're sitting on the back row, you're either going to turn around, but everything is printed off on the table here that we're going to talk through. I know we've got some new members with us this morning, so why don't we just go around the room really quickly and say your name and your organization.
I'm Roy Price. I'm the Director of the Center for Coastal Studies at Virginia Tech.
Troy Hartley, Director of Virginia Sea Grant.
Sean Crumlish, Executive Director, Virginia Resources Authority.
Greg Williams, Norfolk District, East Army Corps of Engineers. Jay Rupa, Planning Director, Creator BC.
Sarah Stewart, Plan RBA.
Jessica Steelman, Coastal Planner with Action Northampton BDC.
Rebecca Murphy, Coastal Program Manager with NPRC. Mary Carson Stiff, Policy Director for Wetlands Watch.
Well, PCR.
Mark Lukenbach, Associate Dean of Research, Virginia.
Elizabeth Andrews, Director, Coastal Policy Center, William and Mary Law School.
Jamie Green, Commissioner of Virginia Marine Resources Commission.
Randy Owen, Chief of the Habitat Management Division for VMRC.
Ken File, Chief Data Officer for the Commonwealth Office of Data Governance and Analytics.
Bill Curtis, Assistant Director, Housing and Community Development.
Evan Bernowski, Chief Stormwater Policy Advisor, Department of Environmental Quality.
Jess Whitehead, Director of the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience at Old Dominion University.
Chris Berg, the Director of Virginia Department of Transportation's Office of Transportation Sustainability.
Chris Swanson, VDOT.
Mike Fitch, Virginia Transportation Research Council.
Kristen Burhoff, Virginia Chamber of Commerce.
Michael Perez, Office of Diversity Opportunity.
Aaron Sutton, Virginia Department of Emergency Management.
Matt Down, Department of Conservation and Recreation.
Dr. Lydia Beeline, Department of Conservation.
Whitney.
We had Martin after a time. Sorry.
All right. Also, again, because we've got some new goals, just a reminder, the purpose of the TAC, this group is charged with assisting the development, the updating, and the implementation of the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan. There's a number of items that fall into that assistance. They're all in the code. This group may be called upon to assist with the statewide plan. As well, for now, we're going to be focusing our efforts on coastal plan because that's what's in front of us, and that's the primary mission of the group. I know everybody in this room is very passionate about the topic, and addressing resilience challenges goes well beyond just this group. It's one of the reasons that we're convening the resilience coordinating working group. But I do want to make sure as we talk through today, as we have our future meetings, that we remember the scope of this group, and we keep that conversations to the scope of the charge forward we got in front of us, because that is plenty of work, I think, for any one group to tackle. As we go about that work, I do want to remind everyone of the 4 principles for Resilient Virginia that the administration has adopted, and the Secretary mentioned them last meeting, but I think they bear repeating. I think they line up well with a lot of work that's already been done, which is that 1, we're committed to addressing challenges related to flooding resilience. 2, we have to address these challenges with programs that work for all impacted parts of Virginia. 3, that the programs we implement have to work together as parts of comprehensive cohesive plans, which is a lot of what we're talking about with this group. And then 4, that the programs, the plans we develop and implement have to be done so with transparency and input from the public, which is a big group. So on that final note, I do want to remind anyone who wants to make a public comment at the end of the meeting, if you're here in person, to please sign up on the sheet by the door or use the chat window if they're joining us virtually. And I do want to give an opportunity. Do we have any staff members joining us online?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Joe Howell and Jill, so welcome to them. All right. I think everybody's got the agenda in front of them. If there's no questions about that, we will start to roll right into it with the adoption of the minutes. We get a motion to adopt the minutes. Greg, is there any discussion about it? Read them, got them memorized. Great. All right, motion to adopt the minutes. All right, second. A lot of motions, a lot of seconds. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. We are now going to move on to reports from DCR staff. We're going to talk about what's going on with the master plan now, summary of the feedback that we got both from this group and the public on phase 1 and the framework. We'll give a quick update on the community outreach engagement plan, and then we'll talk a little bit about subcommittees and the feedback that we got from you all on those and how we're going to be deploying those going forward. And so I'm going to turn it over to Matt Dallin for a while now. Go ahead.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Director Wells provided the outline, what we're going to go over, an update on the master plan, summary of the feedback that we've received both from public comment as well from the TAC members themselves. All of those comments have been posted on our DCR website, as well as those that were submitted to Town Hall are on Town Hall. So we'll go through those and then talk about the community outreach engagement plan and then subcommittees. This handouts have all these slides in front of you. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time for the discussion. So we will start with an update on the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. Just a refresher of what we are charged with doing on this update according to code. And it's due December 31st of 2024. So essentially two years from now, 24 months. It needs to be a place-specific plan for flooding and adhere to the framework principles. We'll discuss some of the framework principles as we review the comments on the framework and the first phase plan. But phase 2 needs to incorporate all major flood hazards. So riverine, fluvial, coastal, comprehensive risk assessment of critical human and natural infrastructure, and then update to our projects, as well as status of what's been implemented, And then phase 2 also needs to implement our community outreach and engagement plan. So that's what we are charged with doing through the end of 2024. Wrong direction. This is an update of where we are at with work items right now. So Dewberry was our contractor and still is our contractor. They completed phase 1 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. We're starting some new work with Dewberry right now. The projects database and the funding database. We are working on an online-based web application for users to sign up and be able to add and edit their own projects. So right now, we do not have that functionality. We're very thankful for the localities, the PDCs, and our other partners for submitting projects last year through Survey 123. We are now taking a similar approach to that, but making a custom kind of online form that you can see your projects, view them, make changes, updates to those projects, or add new projects. And so that has just recently started, and we're also providing that functionality at the funding database as well. So we can add new funding sources and keep that up to date, as well as get others to provide and let us know additional funding sources. So that work was recently kicked off. We're about to kick off pluvial modeling scope of work, where we are looking at doing a pilot study of a small set of basins that represent a kind of a wide range of the land use topography and downstream conditions for the model to test it out, convene stakeholders that are interested in providing feedback, and looking to see then how we can go to the full-scale deployment of the pluvial modeling across the project area. That will likely get started beginning of next year, so next month in January. And then we've also set aside items to update the impact assessment, provide an updated impact assessment report, and update the web explorer that's sharing and showing that information. So that is where we are at with the Dewberry contract. Also, just wanted to highlight some additional DCR efforts that we're working on as well. Community outreach and engagement plan, which we will discuss later today. The status of flood resilience report, which we will discuss a little bit later as well. Annual coordination meetings, working on those. Resilience coordination work group, and then the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan. So there's still a lot going on. What we have in the Dewberry contract doesn't get us to the end of phase 2, but that's where we're going to talk about what we are going to do for what are additional investments that we want to or need to make to complete our planning effort for phase 2.
Any questions on that before we move on?
All right, now into the summary of the TAC and public comments. We'll work through the framework, then get through phase 1, and then some phase 2 comments as well. So we solicited input on what we've done so far. So we sent out a TAC member survey to be completed to give us feedback on the framework, master plan, phase 2. We also put out the framework document, the master planning framework document that was released in October of 2020, I believe, as well as phase 1 out for public comment, 30-day public comment on town hall. Tried to promote and raise awareness of that public comment by a news release, social media, and direct email. We did receive 14 responses from the TAC members, so thank you for putting your time and giving us feedback. And we received 18 public comments between the framework and the phase 1 documents. Those public comments came from individuals, localities, PDCs, NGOs. Some of the letters that we received were a coalition of multiple groups, specifically the NGOs. There was a letter that was submitted that represented 11 different NGOs that they all co-signed
I just want to echo what Matt said and thank everyone who took the time to provide comment, both from TAC and the public. I thought the comments were really thoughtful and I think will be helpful as we move forward. If folks want to review the comments themselves, those are available online. We can send them the link. We're going to summarize a little bit here in a second. And I will say that as we talk through the comments in terms of sort of action items for this group, where we feel like we have open questions or items that need more exploration that might inform phase 2 of the plan, that our intention is to kind of take those and send those out to the subcommittee and have the subcommittee work on them. Actually, don't feel like this is the only opportunity to discuss these things today.
All right, so we'll get into the master planning framework comments. Overall, we were looking for input on our principles that are in the framework, the goals, as well as how the master planning regions were set up and the time horizons. In general, most of the comments were largely supportive of our efforts. We thank you for those, but there is always room for improvement. And we also thank you for highlighting those areas where we can provide additional clarity, do additional work to make this better, work on integration, especially in the master planning regions, and on the time horizons and integrating the different major requirements. So we're going to walk through each of these 4 items in a little more detail.
And if members of the TAC have comments, or if you're the one that put in the public comment and want to elaborate on it, we can talk through that as we go. Raise your hand.
So we listed out the 5 master planning framework principles and asked if you agreed with these principles. I'm just going to read them because I think it's important to hear them in more detail. So principle 1 was acknowledge climate change and its consequences and base decision-making off best available science, largely supportive. Identify and address socioeconomic inequities and work to enhance equity through coastal adaptation and protection efforts. Again, largely supportive of that. Recognize the importance of protecting and enhancing green infrastructure like natural coastal barriers and fish and wildlife habitat by prioritizing nature-based solutions. Mostly agreed. One disagreed with that one. Utilize community and regional scale planning to the maximum extent possible, seeking region-specific approaches tailored to the needs of individual communities. And then lastly, understand fiscal realities and focus on the most cost-effective solutions for protection and adaptation of our coastal communities, businesses, and critical infrastructure. So again,
Matt, sorry, question.
Yeah, we're gonna dig into this kind of.
Yes, and the asterisks.
Yeah, how did you?
So I had a typo. So in the actual principle itself, it says best available science. When I summarized it for the voting, I put best available data.
Okay.
And so that's the asterisk. That is not the correct. We actually don't have defined abbreviated principles. Right? This is kind of just a 2 or 3 word summary of what that principle may represent, and we could change that and better refine that. And that is some of the comments that we received. It's really kind of the devil is in the details and wanting more clarity on some information. And so there were some comments on should we be working with best available science or best available data, with some of the comments pointing to science can be subjective and sometimes divisive depending on the consensus, and that we must be critical in selecting what science we do move forward with, and it should be peer reviewed and be largely supportive and reflective of the spectrum of opinions. Also, how do we consistently use this information, science or data, not only in the master plan, but across agencies and other programs, which gets us to kind of authoritative data sources. Who is the authoritative data source, and how do we use that science and data? Questions on if the science exists, do we then invest to create the data? So we don't have the pluvial data right now, but the pluvial science exists. And we are investing now to create that data for Virginia and coastal planning districts. That's another discussion of kind of how do we really implement this principle. And then really, how do we evolve and adapt to the changing science and data needs? Working with future projections, with uncertainties, things that are getting changed. NOAA updated their sea level rise curves. How do we adapt as a program and incorporate this data and let it be known so people kind of expect it rather than be surprised? So those are the comments we received on the first principle. Any other comments, discussion before we move on to number 2? All right, so with number 2, equity, is it the objective or is it a co-benefit? Should our priorities for flood resilience or coastal flood resilience seek to enhance equity where we can with our flood resilience projects, or is that a primary objective that we're trying to achieve through flood resilience? We also need additional outreach and engagement to identify the equity needs. So additional outreach engagement with vulnerable communities, with our local and regional partners to identify what the needs are to help satisfy their needs. So those are some of the comments that we received on the equity principle. Moving on to natural nature-based solutions. A lot of comments on natural nature-based infrastructure itself versus the solution. And that we have existing natural and nature-based infrastructure that does help with flood resilience. That is critical, that we should be protecting and raising awareness versus a project where we are trying to increase our flood resilience. How do we make it more natural and nature-based, add some more green to the gray to get additional co-benefits from projects? And there were some comments that there is no real consensus on the effectiveness of natural nature-based. So there was comments on both ends of that spectrum. They are very effective, some that they may not be as effective. And so that's kind of ties into the best available science part. A lot of these principles are linked together. And again, how we implement them, looking for input on your thoughts and advisements so that it can. Yes.
At some point moving forward, for clarity, it might be helpful to have a working definition of the term nature-based. I recall from participating in years past on various TACs associated with the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act that we had a lot of discussions around what exactly was a nature-based solution. And some people would say that a nature-based solution is purely a practice that comes directly from nature, but then others would call a nature-based solution what I would consider to be an engineered structural asset, like a stormwater practice that's a constructed wetland. So I think there's some clarity that, you know, we need to get there in order to really understand what's sort of in that large umbrella of topics.
Great, thank you, Evan. And if we are, because we do have people listening in, if possible, could we just announce ourselves before speaking? They do not have a video of the rooms there now. We are speaking. But yes, agreed on that. And that we've received comments along that line on multiple fronts. More definitions, more clarity on the definition so that we understand what we're talking about. On the community and regional scale planning, that was exactly, we need a definition of community and regional scale and how that looks like and how that gets implemented. And one, the comment was that's really workable and implementable. So something that's practical, and we can work with it. And how does that relate to private property ownership, which contains a lot of the edge boundary that we're working on with flooding, largely privately owned. How does that relate to the community and regional scale planning? And how do we get to that implementable phase? And then how does it also relate to the statewide planning at all? So again, additional clarity on how things are connecting. How are we connecting dots? How are we going to implement these principles? On the cost-effective solutions, it really depends on the lens at which you're viewing costs and benefits to determine cost effectiveness. If you are looking through a narrow lens, you could result in a low cost, low bid project that may not be the most cost effective long term if you look wide. And so how do we really, what lens are we going to be looking through? What co-benefits, indirect benefits, how do we capture this to determine what is cost effective? Cost effective for whom and at what scale? Again, more questions that we want to look and answer, but really the devil in the details of how do we really define this so that we can then implement and use that moving forward. Other comments on the cost effectiveness too is really these projects should be economic drivers, almost self-sustaining and paying for themselves. That could be a goal for these projects, and how do we measure and determine that? A question to be determined. And then kind of linking back to the natural nature-based solutions and looking at scale of benefits, how do we see if those solutions are effective? How do we measure their effectiveness and then get to the cost? So there's a lot of still unknowns. This is still a complicated, complex space that we're working in. But again, this is a process that we need to work through it together with input from you all. So that is a summary of the framework principles as far as the comments that we received and some of the questions that we still have, and would look for input either here or through subcommittees to help guide us through this.
This Jay Rupa, Greater PDC. Are we looking at assigning some of these to our subcommittees as objectives to be done this year? Is this going to be our framework, or kind of how are we looking at it?
So we've got, once we talk through this and given an update on a couple of things, we'll talk through subcommittee framework and some deliverables on that. And then our intent, is to take where we have open questions, to take them and most likely assign them to the subcommittee unless we think it's something that they're interested in. So, okay. That's a long way of saying yes.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the explanation. Thank you.
All right, moving on to the framework goals. Again, surveying, do you agree with the framework goals? Again, I'd like to just read them in more detail than just the priority project financing strategy, because those are just abbreviated terms. So please bear with me. Goal number 1, identification of priority projects to increase the resilience of coastal communities, including both built and natural assets at risk due to sea level rise and flooding. Now we should identify critical infrastructure, both built and natural at risk, and then identify projects to protect, adapt, or relocate critical infrastructure. Goal number 2, establishment of a financing strategy informed by regional differences and equity considerations to support execution of the plan. Number 3, effective incorporation of climate change projections into all of the Commonwealth programs addressing coastal zone built and natural infrastructure at risk due to sea level rise and flooding. And lastly, coordination of all state, federal, regional, and local coastal adaptation and protection efforts in accordance with the guiding principles of the treaty. Again, largely supportive of these goals through the TAC member survey, as well as with public comments. But again, getting into some of the details of how do we actually achieve these goals and what do these goals mean. And so on priority projects, a balance between critical infrastructure, vulnerable communities, natural infrastructure, human infrastructure. There's different categories for these different priorities that you can see through different lenses. So how do we go after all of them? Do we pick one now? How do we move forward with establishing priorities? There are different priorities for different people, places. So between Commonwealth priorities, regional, local priorities, different organizational or individual priorities. And they vary in location, locality to locality, region to region. How do we deal with these varying needs and priorities to come up with priority projects? Prioritizing projects as well or different than programs that are really needed to help build and create projects. How do we prioritize these? And then request we should be prioritizing these projects. But again, being clear, who are we prioritizing the projects for? And then once we do, what are we doing with it next? What is the next step in implementation? Which brings us to the funding and financing side, where there were comments requesting essentially communication, coordination, and collaboration. Communicating out how this will be implemented for priority projects, coordinating, working with different entities to make that happen. And that is kind of a request of clarity. How does this move forward? How do we fund projects? Should we be prioritizing if we don't have funding sources already identified? Should we prioritize for a funding source? So there's a lot of, again, options and questions that we still need. On the incorporation of the climate change projections in the Commonwealth programs, again, how do we be adaptive in order to use updated, best available science or data as we move forward? How is that actually implemented across programs? And what does that mean for then regional and local program integration? Is it just for the state or will it be adopted down the line? There were some questions on the coordination as well, in that, again, who is coordinating and for what purpose? So having intentful coordination, not just meeting to meet, but having an objective and working towards that objective through the meeting and through coordination efforts. And how do we continue to support the local and regional efforts where a lot of the implementation is occurring? Essentially, the summary comment that we received is we have these goals and we would like to be using these goals in greater detail to base our decision-making on, but how do we measure ourselves? What are we trying to achieve at the end of 2024, or what are we going to put in that document at the end of 2024? And how do we monitor, evaluate, and reevaluate our progress and what needs to be done next? What performance metrics focused on outcomes, not just effort? So that's a summary of our framework goals. Any comments, questions before moving on? All right. Next is master planning regions. Do you agree with the organization of these readings? This was the biggest split of disagreement. So we had some disagreements on this one. And I think it's valid. So we had comments, just the grouping. Right now, we have 4 master planning regions consisting of 1 to 3 PDCs. And there were comments that the groupings may not represent, the master planning grouping of PDCs may not be reflective. There might be enough individual character in a PDC to be separate or different. The terminology, there were some comments on how do we refer to these groups? Is the rural planning region the best representation of that region? And then importantly, how do we integrate this into our statewide plan? The statewide plan is due in December of 26 with a major watershed-based approach. And so the figure that you're seeing is an overlay of the major river basins with the 21 PDCs. And so how do we report? So I guess there's two options, kind of, how do we do the analysis, collect the information? We're working with water, which doesn't acknowledge boundaries and jurisdictions. But then at the same time, there are localities that need to make decisions and implement these projects and know what the impacts are within their jurisdiction. Should we choose one or the other, do both? This gets to some of kind of our investment decisions moving forward. Everything's kind of possible, but you got to pay for it and decide how you want to do it. And so what works best for our users too? This is ultimately a plan for the people that are implementing this. What do you all need from us? What is your preferred thing? And I think we'll get into kind of more sets of needs in the next slide. So any comments on planning areas? We're getting into timelines. All right. Do you agree with the planning horizons? We did 2020, 40, 60, 80. We do have 2100 for the hazard, but did not do the impact. Mostly agree with us, which is great. Put this slide in here just as a break and thinking that this is a continual process. And so looking at what's being done in the National Climate Assessment Progression, which the 22 version is currently out for public comment.
That's correct.
But each progression, they get a little bit further in the planning process and kind of reevaluate. And so we have this 5-year process that we're working with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan as well. And so each cycle we can update and advance and improve. And so as we move forward to the December 24 deadline, phase 2, how do we do this? And if we're incorporating all major flood hazards, they all don't line up nicely with the 2020, 40, 60, 80, 2100 time frame that we have. Some of the pluvial inputs that we're looking at have kind of a 50-year span of 2020, 2070, 2050 to 2100. How do we line that up? And then if we get into riverine discharge, which we don't have really consensus on future projections, how does that work together? And then compound flooding to make it even more complicated, and trying to display all that information and give people the information they need to make more informed decisions for the future. So those are trying to figure out how to do this. Do we simplify it, reduce the number, present it both ways as a kind of elevation rise or feet above a flood elevation, or do we do some time periods? Watershed versus locality. Some of the data is very location specific or how it's reported. So how do we, again, what do you all need? What do we need to implement this across state agencies, across the regions and localities? What is needed? And then we can try to see if we can meet that need. Any comments, questions on the framework before moving into phase 1? Yes, sure.
So this is our advice from the tech. The second bullet, integrating major makes an excellent case for the best available science, because this is the best available data and they oftentimes don't match. I do some research on the James River Basin where we look at different data sets from USGS and NOAA, and there are different spatial scales. So the data is there, and that's the best available data, but they oftentimes don't match up. And they need to be treated in ways that make them possible to use for decision making. So I think maybe what we should commit to in terms of what's it called, the guiding principles or something like that. We should commit to quantitative science, using quantitative science to make the decision of produce the product. But the commitment should be to the best available quantitative science. Otherwise, it is an excellent case where we have really good data, but it doesn't do anything for us. Whereas science can really help making sense of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can always try to improve, right? So what do we need to make a decision for planning? It's different than maybe regulations and policy and legislation, as well as design. Right? Those are all different types of decisions that may require different levels of information.
And that's by science.
We're just piling it on more complications.
Well, and I think Matt, to one of your earlier points, there are areas where the science is there, but we don't have the data yet. And so one of those decision points is where do we make investments on generating that data? Can we find that data elsewhere? Is it meaningful and useful and actionable? All good questions that we need to kind of work through.
I mean, the basic task of science is figuring things out and making something actionable, right? So at least that.
Yes, no, I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, phase one. Might be a little bit quicker through this. Spend some more time on phase two. So there's 3 areas that we focus on: our outreach and engagement. Overall, our improvements are needed throughout that. Our technical study, a lot of comments for what we did was good, but we need all major flood hazards, more information on the critical, human, and natural. And then on our plan delivery, how does this fold into the statewide? So step through some of these. Our outreach and engagement question was rate the effectiveness of it. TAC and subcommittees were included in that. This is a public meeting. Anytime we have public contact, essentially it's a contact point where information is made available, as well as meeting with our federal partners, regional partners, localities, the public, and then within that public, the vulnerable communities. A lot of improvement is needed, really commitment of time and resources to do it. And we are committed and working on the community outreach engagement. So communication, coordination, collaboration, it's kind of letting people know what we're doing, communicating it out, what we're trying to achieve, working with partners that are also working with those stakeholders as well, and trying to leverage others' efforts and to really maximize the returns. Really more in supporting community-led planning efforts. What are the needs of the community? What resources can the Commonwealth provide to facilitate this process? What can we do to collect and share community data? And then also combining Coastal Resilience Master Plan with the Community Flood Preparedness Fund outreach. Those were largely separate last year, and we're not connecting the planning part with the money part. So how can we do that better moving forward? And really just communicating the path forward, letting people know what we plan to do, what we're trying to achieve to get more support, build more awareness, and get more. On the technical study, as far as doing our exposure, coastal flood hazard exposure analysis, the impacts, community context, our database, project evaluation. Up front, our impact assessment was supported, but we need some improvements on the project, database, project evaluation, and then the funding as well. So some of the comments that we received, again, we need all major flood hazards included. Acknowledge that. Additional work on the critical infrastructure of natural nature-based systems. So we have wetlands in there, but what are the critical wetlands? What are those impacts? How do we then prioritize that? Impacts to natural infrastructure as well, along the same line of how do we evaluate the impacts to natural infrastructure from our projects and in the planning part. If a lot of this work is in the intertidal zone or along the edge, what are we considering as far as the impacts of putting that project in there as well? The project database is not inclusive of all projects. We We acknowledge that and struggle to get all the projects in. Not every community has the capacity, especially given a short window last summer to get projects into the database. And because they're not in there, it doesn't reflect great on us, either not having these projects that we know exist. So we are investing there, making that database accessible. But there is still asks for additional capacity. And what are we doing to support the capacity at the locality or regional level to get this in? Also, comments and questions on what are we doing with the database? What is it for? Why are we buying in? Why are we spending the time to get it in, right? So just some bullet points on what we see as the value and benefit of this project database. It is a state resource. You don't have to create your own. It's a starting point, especially if you don't have, if you're under-resourced. If you have your resources and have it all, I see what you guys have here. I know, but we can work together. It helps support public outreach too. It's publicly facing. Residents in your communities can see what you have planned or what to do to address issues. Your neighbors can also see what you're trying to do to see if we can collaborate better. So it's a way to increase outreach and collaboration. For the flood fund resilience plan, it needs to be project-based. This can serve as your project list to help meet that need. For prioritization, we need to know what projects we're prioritizing, and we're prioritizing projects that are, still doesn't answer what we're doing once we prioritize. And I know that's a question for what are we doing to implement these and how are we going to get funding, but you want to win the lottery, you got to play the lottery. You got to be in the system to be evaluated and to help us. And to be part of the larger state plan, which is also can be supportive for other grant applications to be part of a larger, broader community, regional, statewide plan.
So you just need to be careful because not all projects are planned in advance. Sometimes there might be a resilience project that just comes up in the aftermath of the storm or event or whatever. And so it didn't make it into a capital improvement plan. And you need to not knock that because it could be a really beneficial project. So we just need to be careful if we're going to utilize a database as a way of prioritizing projects that are not overlooking potential projects that just didn't have that time frame.
Understood.
Yeah, as the project database and the online tool is being developed, it'd be helpful to keep in mind that there are hundreds of projects that are installed by localities and private properties that are intended to improve water quality, but they provide flooding ancillary benefits as well. And we are tracking so mmany of those projects for a lot of reasons, but also for primarily regulatory compliance with federal government's requirements on the state and the continent of Virginia and localities. And it might be useful to have some coordination between those various databases and the new one we're developing, both to ensure that we're getting everything, but then also just not to have kind of two different sets, one tracking resiliency projects, one tracking water quality, when there are so many mutual benefits between those two. So I think that might be something to just keep in mind as we move forward.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo what you just said. I'm glad to hear you say that on the DEQ side, but I also have VDOT in the room. I know VDOT does a lot with their projects that of course affect water quality, that sometimes the locality doesn't know that the VDOT project's coming in because it's a federal highway project or something like that. And we don't know how it's affecting water quality, or if the project is there because of low water quality, or if it's just there for road improvement. I know when we look at some of the long-term sea level rise, it's going to inundate some parts of possibly 95 or parts of some of the interstates down further. And I don't as a locality or as a regional locality, we don't know how the state agency's handling that, or if that's something that's going to be put down into the MPO level. So that's something, that would be another database coordination on how we're looking at projects that way. I know we've reached out a little bit for some coordination with your environmental group, and have been helpful and responsive, but I think that would be another level of database coordination. And then again, how can maybe MPOs leverage some funding to help with that? Is there a separate category where we're not just looking at the typical highway safety measures, but hey, we need to elevate a bridge because it's going to flood out in the next 50 years. So, who do we coordinate with VDOT on that?
Yeah, I think this is an important conversation, and I want to build upon just two quick items on that. I'll give you two real world examples. We DEQ have to report the installation of stormwater projects to track progress toward meeting Chesapeake Bay watershed implementation plan goals under the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. And so if there's a large resiliency project that a locality is installing that we're just not aware of because they're doing it for another purpose, if there's an opportunity to identify the water quality benefits, the pollutant removal coming out of that project, that's really helpful to both that locality and the state, because that's another project that's been funded, that will be maintained, that we can claim credit for. I think vice versa, if there's a water quality project that's going in, but there's something that can be slightly changed during like the initial scoping of that project to provide greater flooding benefits at a low cost, because the capital cost is already being used, for the water quality benefit. Let's take advantage of that. And so that level of detailed coordination, if this is a venue that can help support that, I think there's just great benefits all around. So I'm agreeing with you.
And Evan, to your point on, I think there's an opportunity there with non-joint source projects.
Yeah, as well, absolutely. And that's a good point. I'm thinking primarily in the urban context, but yeah, I agree as well.
Chris Swanson, VDOT. I just want to share, you might be aware, we just released a resilience plan yesterday that speaks to the need to do outreach and coordination with local and regional entities so that we're all sort of understanding what's happening at the various levels. And to just sort of reiterate what Matt brought up, in that coordination, it'll be important to identify who's leading the coordination and for what purpose. I think each meeting might have a different purpose, and who leads that coordination will be important as we move forward.
Yeah. I think if it's interesting to this group, but maybe a friend from VDOT might want to present on the resilience plan in the future meeting.
We'd be glad to.
Yeah.
And I know we're working with VDOT and other state agencies on the development of state floodplain standards as well, so that we try to get ahead of that in the project development.
Yeah, and I know like from our regional efforts with VDOT, and we know that there are projects going on, but we wouldn't have known if we didn't reach out and ask. For example, 288 corridor, using some of the median and loop structures and putting best management practices in there to control water quality. That was a state project, a pilot project kind of going on. I think it was a great one, but we didn't even know that was happening in Chesterfield until we got a update on it. So kind of just a little more back and forth with that. But I do think there is a synergy out there of these project databases where we could help y'all and y'all could help us reach across the table both sides.
Thank you for all that. I think with that, tying it to our database, I don't think a database will ever solve that. The computer will never do this all. It's really the human interactions and relationships that we need to establish, bringing everybody together here at this TAC on a weekly basis. And these are opportunities to collide with others outside of your agency, region, location to help this coordination.
And I think that's, you mentioned coordination. I think some of this kind of gets into what we want to accomplish with the Resilience Coordinating Working Group, which is to get beyond just the personal relationships are important, but to figure out how we kind of institutionalize these conversations so that they exist beyond the kind of relationships that we build. Great.
Plan delivery, producing the result of phase one, produce the website, the PDF document and hard copy, our web explorer, and our data and largely supportive. Some of the comments: who is this data for? Who is the end user? The individual? Is it programs and communities? How do we try to resolve who we're doing this for and be focused? Trying to meet everybody's needs is really possible and difficult. So having a focus for that. The schedule and knowing what the end product was going to be last year. It's been a fire drill, 9 months to get that all done. And there was a lot of unknowns of what it was going to end up. What was it going to be at the end? And that was a surprise to people, as well as kind of the schedule about how it got done. So we can work on that for phase 2. Again, how do we integrate this with the statewide plan? Those plans, according to code, need to be integrated. How do we do that? And then consider some of the 21 TAC recommendations moving forward.
Any other, before we leave the public comments survey results, any other comments or results on that? One thing, Matt and his team and our staff for compiling a whole bunch of comments into, I think, a very useful, digestible.
All right, moving into phase 2. A lot of these comments were echoed earlier in our technical study, expanding to all major flood hazards, working on our impacts across the board, coordination. There were some requests for kind of resilience data catalog, which gets back to who's the authoritative data source, how do we communicate that out to people, let them know. Coordination between the asset owners. A lot of these assets, critical assets, privately owned. We don't have control over this. There's assets that are regulated beyond DCR, controlled beyond DCR. How do we work on that coordination? Again, flood fund, funding with the planning, tying those two together. Statewide integration, funding. What is the funding? How do we get it? How does that work? How do we implement it at the local and state levels? What does this mean for us moving forward? And push for bigger, more community, whole community approach to planning. How do we get the input from the community and the support to build these from the ground up?
Hey, Matt, Chris Swanson, VDOT. In terms of your comment regarding assigning authoritative data sources, I also want to bring up the idea that sometimes the authoritative data source might not be there. So how does that assignment of who's going to be the authoritative owner, I think we should work through. Maybe that's the work group that you're referring to, Director Wells. But I think that's an important topic to discuss.
Yes, I agree. There's a lot of people in similar spaces too, and how would that get resolved? What is the governance structure for resolving? So just kind of thinking about how we implement and what we can do moving forward in phase 2. A cycle of planning and identifying what we want to be, what are our needs, kind of what are the solutions to try to close those gaps, try to implement it and reevaluate it. There's some services that the Commonwealth can provide between technical study and information, funding, outreach, engagement, policy plans, kind of just an overview of different options to move forward with. Again, really trying to figure out what do communities need to proceed or to succeed to help implement this and move the Commonwealth further, which is really questions then for us, where do we want to invest moving forward to move this forward? So I'm going to bring it back to the code requirements again, because these are our legislative requirements moving forward, all major flood hazards, critical human natural infrastructure assessment, our projects, and implementing phase 2 of, or implementing the outreach engagement plan. And so we're going to walk through the 3 bullet points first. So major flood hazards. We have opportunities to invest in coastal flooding and updating and adopting the 22 sea level rise projections. We can invest in updating our exposure and impacts. We are investing in the fluvial flooding side. On the fluvial flooding, We do have some new data from FEMA, some updated HEC models for their flooding that have multi-frequency flooding. There, we can use that data. We didn't have it across the state. So that's what the areas, you can't see it on your map, the darkest. It's a blue up on the screen. Those models are available for download. You can use them. Green ones should be coming soon. So we have some new data in the coastal zone that we didn't have. Use that and try to invest in looking at the impacts. And then how do we use that to look forward and identify what those future fluvial impacts and exposure. And then we can invest in the compound flooding, looking at the historical analysis of when those items happen, rain and surge, or rain and rain. What is the frequency? So we are more informed that when we have this data, we are aware of when they occur together to better be informed in our decision. And that could then inform future modeling to see what those impacts could be and run future scenarios. So a lot of investment options moving forward for the major flood hazards. On the risk and our comprehensive assessment of the human infrastructure, the natural infrastructure, and our critical infrastructure. This ties into a status of flood resilience report, which is required now by code through the 22 General Assembly. We need to provide a report on the status of flood resilience across the Commonwealth for these human, natural, critical infrastructure, and what is the overall status of planning. So just the figure on the right is the foundational infrastructure framework. Everything is connected, right? Co-located, interdependence. We need some of these foundational infrastructure systems in order to provide essential services, in order to provide then community services. So that's just a lens to look at the critical infrastructure side. But this is something that we need to work on this status of flood resilience report. So this report is due July of 23, 8 months from now. We're planning really establishing a framework of how we can do this critical human and natural assessment, what we have available, what is the overall status of flood resilience planning in the Commonwealth, but really invest then in doing that impact assessment and really doing the needs assessment across the region, state agencies, critical asset owners, both public and private.
I mean, this piece, it seems like it gets one of the big gaps in terms of in places where you can do sort of assessment, like, okay, we've got assets that are vulnerable. Is anybody working on a plan or a design to solve it? Is that what you're trying to do with the needs assessment? I don't think of that term quite that way. Usually that's like, I've already designed something, I know how much it costs, I don't have the money, but we have situations where it's, I've got a problem.
So
I can't get to, the design or anything.
I think we're in multiple stages. There's some places that they're not aware of the problem, of what the future problem could be. So they have the need just to be better informed. Then you have people that are informed and identify what their needs are, but don't know what to do with it, right? What is the solution? What are the options to address this? Then you pick a solution. How do we implement this? How do we pay for it? So, I mean, there's needs across the spectrum of the entire kind of planning continuum.
I agree with you. I'm just like, is that what you're trying to do by July?
We cannot complete the needs assessment by July. No, you're not going to complete.
I'm just wondering what
we want to establish a framework. How do we do this? How do we capture this information? What is the way? And then can we, by July, if we figure out how we're going to do it, start getting that interface?
I feel like reports usually are a list, and so like that would be a much more complicated.
Yes. Oh, it is. Do we have the data? How do we collect all this information to determine this? We don't, it's not this, again, DCR doesn't really own a lot of these assets. We aren't project owners either. So we need to gather information across the board to try to provide an overall status to the county. It is a big task, but at least trying to figure out what we want to do at the end, and then try to see if we can work through it and what are the gaps. There will be areas where we won't be able to complete a needs assessment, but we need to complete a needs assessment.
Very good.
Well, I'm just kind of following up on Whitney's question. The impacts are being assessed based on the new data, running it through the web model, which shows the impacts to human, natural, built environment, right? And we have that impact in, miles of roads, number of structures. That's part of what Dewberry completed in phase 1. So to me, the risk assessment is what is critical. Is that more accurate? Because I think we're talking about, I'm not sure how you can do that, but hopefully that's what this is really about, because we should know what the impacts are. Where we don't have consensus, and we certainly don't have a plan, is what is critical, who regards it as such, and who doesn't? And how can we move past some of those limitations and some of those disagreements?
Yes, we do have we have the exposure of a category of assets, critical human risk, but it's very difficult to prioritize those if you don't know how sensitive they are to that impact, if they can recover and get to the criticality. How critical is it to the state could be different than how critical it is to a community or region. So yes, we do want to go there.
Okay.
That was in kind of our technical study improvements from phase 1. How do we get at the criticality of these items? And so we hope to figure out, can we establish a framework to get there and then try to do it?
Okay, I think that's helpful.
You need a different term, right? Because critical is, as you look at the slide before, it says it's all this.
Cool.
Right? I don't know what the better term is. Because you're saying it's more, what's important, what's the priority, right?
Well, that's the definition, the list in the slide previous came from statute, right?
Right.
Yes. So those are categories of critical infrastructure, but does not address the criticality of the, and yes, we can, I'm looking for wordsmith. I think in the VDOT resilience plan, they propose some terminology that we can look at.
I was just,
Sorry, Aaron, and VDOT, because this drifts into, we track critical infrastructure as it relates to emergency management and actually have a critical infrastructure VDOT that works with Fusion Center and state police on that side of critical infrastructure. So, everybody has different lists.
We do. Like, this is the foundational infrastructure framework is a way to categorize built volume services too. You have the FEMA lifelines.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ways to slice and dice this. Yes. We do need to define it so people are aware of it.
Your needs assessment, sorry, Dante, the Northern Plan. And the needs assessment, the risk assessment is critical. And I'll remind everybody that that already happens on a 5-year-old basis with every locality that they do an asset engagement plan. And we're doing that, and that's why we chose to adopt and incorporate resilience to that plan. So we know what's at most risk and we can prioritize what's at most risk. And then it takes the guesswork out of the, which projects get implemented. You don't have that anymore. You chose the projects that were at most risk.
I think that's one of the administration's principles for how we move forward. It needs to be comprehensive, using what's already being done. Should we make you redo a risk assessment if you already have one? It doesn't make sense, right?
So it's a crappy risk.
It's done in different ways too, so it's, again, in the details of it, but yes, trying to leverage what's done locally and regionally and across the state the state's doing a state hazard mitigation plan. It includes flood risks.
So is the state going to review the hazard mitigation plans of all of our regions and determine, I mean, in this process, and determine what Northern Neck regards as most critical?
Are we determining that?
Well, as part of this assessment,
Are we reviewing it and including it?
I'm just wondering what the end product will look like, you know?
Yeah, and a similar question, Elizabeth Andrews. I'm just trying to figure out the process that we're talking about here. I think I've lost a grip on that because we have, as you said, critical infrastructure defined by the code. But now we need to look at criticality and vulnerability and how does that tie in with the subcommittees and who's doing what?
That is the challenge. How do we do this all? That is what we're looking to establish with this framework document, the status of this report, which is a statewide report as well. But yes, those are the questions. How do we organize this? How do we coordinate this? How does this work?
I think when we get to talking about the subcommittee, if to the degree that they're not already slotted into a subcommittee.
So can I?
Sarah?
Plan RVA has just been awarded a grant to evaluate and map critical infrastructure in our region for exactly some of these questions. I would also caution, or we should consider how we would approach just pulling out critical infrastructure as in each regional hazard mitigation plan, because the purpose of the hazard mitigation plan was not exactly the purpose of this. However, it can be a very informative resource, same with the state. But yeah, all these questions that are coming up, we have somewhat in a slightly different form discussed there within our region. So it would be great if we were at the end of that process. They could then inform everyone of the roadblocks and considerations we hit. But I just thought I should offer that up to the table, and hopefully that could help this, or this process can help that. Or, but yeah, these are really good questions, everybody. And I'm not sure as we go to get to work.
I think there's going to be a lot of conversation between us and localities and PDCs about what you all have a plan PDCs about what you all have going on, what might be in your hazard mitigation plan now that can inform this, where there are gaps, all of that. Again, this is, and then that's why we did one, I was just a little bit earlier up the wheel, but that is why we wanted to highlight the iterative nature of the process, in that it is going to be one of those things where we get a little bit further each time. This is a biannual report that kind of lives on its own. So I think each time the further, get a little bit further. I don't think anybody expects us to have this thing solved by July of next year. So.
Just make a suggestion, because I think one of the things that would have made the phase one report look better would be to just identify the things that are gaps you can't get to. You know, because sometimes that you read a report and you kind of want to button it up nice, like, here we go. And it's not, especially if somebody hasn't been involved in the whole process, you can't tell, well, we knew we should have done this piece, but we couldn't do it, you know?
Well, and I think
Make the iterations better.
Well, no, I think you made a really good point there, because when we say needs assessment, we probably need to say needs assessment and gap analysis. That probably gets to, I think, what you're driving at. I think that's important.
Speaking of projects, we have looked through all of the state and regional hazard mitigation plans. There's over 1,000 projects across this Commonwealth. We know people are thinking about flooding already. They're not in our database. Do we fund them, or do we help do that in the future? I mean, that's an investment and coordination effort, right? To do it. DEQ is funding the coastal PDCs to develop priority projects lists for flood resilience, trying to get those projects into the database. All the different projects that are in a flood fund, resilience plan, trying to get them in. So yes, we would like to see additional projects and invest in trying to get those into our database, as well as providing additional outreach and training on how to work with this. Community outreach and engagement, there are a lot of opportunities for us to improve and invest in this. We'll cover it some more in the update on the outreach and engagement plan, but we need to increase base level education and awareness, community-centered public information. Should this date, should we invest in kind of curating a larger area? Community lived experiences and flooding challenges, instead of that just being that in every community, can we provide that as a resource? Project development, technical assistance. How do we help communities identify if they have a need? What are the project options for them to consider? And then they can consider that with the community to decide how they want to move forward. So there's a lot of opportunities for investment in community outreach and engagement. Here's what the schedule looks like. All right, phase 2, 24 months away. Working on the fluvial modeling, should get started next month. We have started on the web app. We still have to decide some of these investments and what we're going to do for phase 2 done, while also working on the status of the studies report, and the coordination work group report is due in November. 2 years is not a lot of time to get this all done. So to your point, state what we're going to do, what we're not going to do, and start getting. Pulling back again, the master planning framework document lists some objectives of what we're trying to achieve here. That I think we were mentioning our unified comprehensive strategy and preferred approaches to improve resilience. How do we decide which areas or projects are most deserving of our limited resources? How do we get, that is still kind of a goal, and then helping to implement that without making other areas worse with funding. So how do we do it on a larger scale? And financing the projects. How do we pay for what we think we want to invest in? And so the framework document states that we were going to have a detailed plan divided by region, priority projects according to state guidelines, with the local and regional needs included, as well as how do we determine state administered flood preparedness disaster mitigation funding. How does that work? That is spread out across multiple agencies. How does that coordination work? And really, the coordination is needed at the top level of state government and the governor's office to help ensure we are coordinating in an effective manner and trying to eliminate duplication and unintended consequences. So that's what we're trying to achieve.
Could you back up one slide? Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I'm realizing as we're talking about regional, local criticality, vulnerability, we haven't talked about what if it comes out in the data that some areas are much more at risk than others. Some areas have much more existing infrastructure at risk than others. Is there anything built into the plan about equity and distribution of prioritization of projects?
That is the question, right? How do we decide?
Right, so that's still up in the air. I just want to note that because I haven't seen it on any slides, and that is an issue, right? Some areas that are already built out would have a lot more expensive infrastructure impacts than areas that aren't built out. They would have different kinds of impacts. And so is there almost like an equity concern about that, about distribution of funding across the state? I'm just raising that because I'm not seeing it on the slide. Yeah.
Jessica Stone and AMPDC, can I just piggyback on that with the historically disadvantaged areas too that aren't getting as much of a look at the, I know we talked about historical flooding, but tying into that equity with the historically disadvantaged communities. So looking at, I guess, for example, on the Eastern Shore, the areas that have historically been disadvantaged continue to be disadvantaged, but we haven't, as a collective, always look back at the historical disadvantages the community has faced as much as we have at the geography percent. So kind of encompassing all of the disadvantages as opposed to just the looking at the land, focusing more on that.
So I guess what I was trying to get at is that I don't want us to get to the end of this process and we have done a very scientifically valid process, right? And then we go, uh-oh, did we think about the fact, we want to make sure up front we have all the factors built in that we want to have built in. And you don't want, just hold Jessica's example, you don't want to have like nothing going on the Eastern Shore and everything going on the other side of the bay because we haven't taken into account, do we want to have a distribution? And if we do, what is, I don't want to be the one to answer that. What is a fair and equitable distribution? Make sure I'm not on that subject. So I just want to raise it because I'm not seeing it on the slides yet. It's in the background of any kind of overarching Commonwealth-wide discussion.
Well, and I think that gets back to one of the core principles that I talked about at the beginning of the meeting, which is the programs that we have to work for all parts of Virginia. And I think sort of inherent in that is not shutting anybody out.
And then kind of a piggyback question. I don't recall if I've seen a recent full tech list. Is there, I see the Corps of Engineers is with us today. Is there a member of the DOD, Navy base, somebody else on this tech? I can't remember.
We have Joe Howe from the Navy. He's an advisor.
Oh, that's right.
And he's listing on that.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to make sure that that's there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add one thing that popped into my mind as we're looking at all of these, piggybacking on Elizabeth's a little bit. Jess Whitehead, ODUI car. There is, I think, one thing that we need to think about in the framework is the projects, I think, as we all have in our heads, are dealing with places that are already at risk. We have rural areas that are under urbanization pressure. And how are we also thinking about the ways that we're supporting the PDCs and making sure that we are not urbanizing into areas that will be at future risk? It's always cheaper to avoid a problem up front than it is to try to solve it on the back end. And so trying to think about how we are including those in a framework, I think, is something really important.
Yeah, but what I feel like I'm hearing is almost like this discussion around weighting criteria, what could be the factors and things like that. I would just add to that discussion. And I think this also gets to equity. It also gets to economic development. The placement of a resiliency project can affect a property's ability to get federal flood insurance, can affect the property's ability to get private flood insurance. And if we're trying to do economic development in certain areas, it's worth considering that could there be strategically placed resiliency projects that could make certain communities more resilient, make them more able to get insurance rates at appropriate levels. That's all sort of part of this discussion, and it's not a minor one. So let's add that to the mix.
Well, I think we may have gotten, Mark looking about Virginia Bring Science. I raised my hand a little bit earlier. The part we were going around and around before on equity, I just wanted to find, we're retreading a little bit of ground that happened previously before the last report, which was sort of, there seemed to be agreement on it. Norfolk's most important project is its most important project. It's not more important than Accomack County's most important project. That's still their most important project. So I felt like we had articulated that pretty well in round one. Now, how you actually go out implementing it is a different question.
And I think that all of this sort of gets to what the need for a plan, because we evaluate flood fund applications. We're kind of looking at all of those in a vacuum, right? We score them based on the manual, but we score them based on the manual what came in. Not looking at, we don't really have a whole picture of it. Very good point.
Well, it sounds, excuse me, it also sounds like in the first iteration, we talked about those issues, but they weren't put into a plan.
Resolved.
Right, they were institutionalized.
They were institutionalized. So if we're trying to make phase two an actual plan, then the discussion evolves. And it sounds like that is the intention of the iteration.
We like it, we like the tax question.
So what will phase two include? Starting with the end in mind, what we would like to for the near term. Really, the vision for the future. What are we trying to accomplish here in the next, we have to do this again in 5 years. What are we trying to get done? Having a clear vision for the future. We have to have our major flood hazard exposure, our critical infrastructure, human, natural infrastructure assessment. Our needs, what are our priority needs for that critical built human infrastructure? What are the planning needs, the development needs, the project implementation needs? I think, what are those needs and how do we prioritize them are some of the discussions. So can we lay that out? We'd like to have a plan of action that states what the Commonwealth is doing to identify and meeting these needs. Moving forward, through outreach, funding, policy, guidance, projects. And then what do we want, expect, recommend, and need forward from others? We cannot do this. I don't think a lot of people want us to tell them what to do, but what, being clear, what risk are we taking on, and what do we need the others to do? Who owns what risk? So we're clear on and coordinating how we move forward together. So I'm hoping with the code requirements, that data and information, so we need to present it in a manner that allows people to make more informed decisions. Which means we need to know what those decision points are that people are looking to answer, try to answer, which gets to our needs. So we're still early on. Last year was phase one, 9 months. Working now here on phase 2 through 24. We're still iterating and trying to get better each step of the way. This is a process. We are not going to solve coastal resilience problems in phase 2. We will revisit it every 5 years. We need to make progress. What do we want to get done here is outlined for the next 2 years. How do we measure that, have some metrics, and then reevaluate and decide what we're doing next. Because there are a lot of options for where we want to invest. There are a lot of unknown questions. We spread ourselves thin, try to do everything, probably will not get everything. So what are our priorities? What is the need that you all like to see if it's not in here, that you need or want in the next 2 years? That is where we are headed, and we will continue to provide updates on a quarterly basis, and receiving input at any time is always welcome.
And I will say that, you know, about a nickel for every time in an attack meeting, I sat through a presentation, and then like half an hour after I got in the car, I had a thought that I wish I had shared. I'd have like at least 25 cents. But for members that have thoughts or reactions to this after the fact, please do feel free to share those. Just as a reminder, FOIA, send them to staff will distribute them. But don't feel like this is if you didn't say something today that you can't ever say. All right, I'm going to talk about the community outreach engagement plan so that Matt gets a little bit of a break. It's going to be a short break, Matt, sorry. All right, just a reminder, what we're required to do, DPR with DOI, in coordination with Chief Resilience Officer and the SACAP, are required to prepare the community outreach engagement plan that informs the CRT and the statewide plan The outreach engagement plan is designed to drive for meaningful involvement by ensuring essentially that people that are impacted by all these things have a seat at the table and meaningful input. So we are required to prepare something by the end of the year. So Matt, you want to talk about where we are? So where we are, we have a draft right now. It's undergoing executive review, and the kind of the way that we have chosen to put this together is as a framework and kind of a living document that we can adapt as the coastal plan and the statewide plans are developed. So what we're doing is setting out, these are the things generally that we want to do. These are the important aspects that we think need to be included in public outreach as we conduct these plans. I think one of the key things for us is trying to take a whole community approach here, and to go beyond the TAC, as it were, right? Everybody in this room is a very important voice in this process. Well, the subject matter experts, you represent localities, but the people in this room aren't the only voices in the process that we need to take into account. And so one of the goals of the plan, the outreach plan framework that we're putting together, is what are some of the ways that we're going to get outside of this room and into the community and engage those folks. So our plan is to button this up in the next week or two to get it out for public 30-day comments. We'll have it prepared by the end of the year. That's the goal. I feel comfortable extending the public comment period a little bit past the end of the year. If that means that people have an opportunity to provide the input they need to provide. We are required also to consult with, there's a couple of groups and stakeholders that are required to consult, so that'll be part of the public comment period. And then in 23, we'll publish the final plan. Kind of our goal in all of this is, as we fold this into the coastal and statewide plans, to leverage external support to implement this. This is going to be a lot more than DCR staff can do. So whether that's a contractor or whether that's other third parties that can come in and support us, I think those are all things that we're taking a look at. But essentially, we're structuring this as a framework that interested parties could respond to and say, here's how we think we can help you implement that. It may be one external party that helps us with this. It may be multiples. I think we're kind of still that. So that's where we are with the COEP. Any questions? That was your break, Matt. Sorry.
All right. Subcommittee discussion. We did receive some feedback from TAC members on the subcommittees and their objectives that we had sent out and discussed at the previous TAC meeting in September. You recall, were there 7 subcommittees? 7 subcommittees last year. We decided to narrow that down and consolidate some and to mirror the framework goals to project prioritization, funding, research data, and innovation, outreach, and coordination. We received comments of adding a public policy subcommittee. It was considered, but determined it really kind of fell out of the scope of what we're trying to achieve here. So we're sticking with the 4 subcommittees.
And I will say, I think the general expectation is that there will be probably some public policy discussions that happen within the framework of the other subcommittees. We just didn't think that a specific public policy committee was warranted here. We also have the opportunity to create ad hoc committees as we go along. We feel like there's something that we really just drill down into. But for the purposes of this being an ongoing group that will exist, I can't remember the legislation to sunset date, but it'll exist for a while. We felt like these were good for.
All right, so the project prioritization subcommittee, the objectives largely the same. Again, some comments which we discussed earlier. Whose priorities are we establishing? State, regional, local, individual. How do we balance those different priorities? How do we balance the human-built natural needs, prioritize those as well. Equity, right? How do we prioritize that? That's all part of kind of this discussion on how do we choose, how do we pick and choose? Because that's what ultimately we're trying to do. And that's a difficult thing to do with a lot of needs and limited resources. How do you do that? That is kind of a summary of the project prioritization. Funding subcommittee, paying for it. Again, who is this financing for? State financing for the localities, for the regions. Again, looking for some more clarity on these objectives, some of the comments on what are our desired outcomes for this, and then what are the methods to support some of the local revenue needs to really build some of the capacity to do this effort where it's largely machine. So we did receive this input on the funding subcommittee, and we'll work, I guess, just overall, taking in this input from you all. We'll get into the next steps in a couple slides, which we'll talk about how to move forward. So just bear with me on the research and data, added innovation to the subcommittee title as well, to really capture some of the human capital and infrastructure that we need to plan, design, construct, monitor. How do we do this with the workforce? How do we have new technologies that can support implementing this? How do we identify what's the right data to use, the right research and science? That is kind of the summary of the charge that we have in this subcommittee. And then our outreach and engagement, or outreach and coordination subcommittee. Again, clarity, who's doing what, for what purpose, being clear. One of the comments is, how does this outreach engagement, how can we help this implementation with our tribal nation? How does that work? Trying to give some more clarity. So expanding our outreach and engagement activities. So that was quick. Next steps. We are asking that you serve on at least one subcommittee moving forward. We will send a poll for your preferences to rate or rank which subcommittee you would prefer to serve on. Based on that input, our CRO, Chief Resilience Officer, will designate subcommittee chairs in the membership, as well as sending you a charge with prioritized objectives that we would like the subcommittee to achieve.
So we'll take on that, we'll take the objectives that we kind of just went through on the slides there. We'll take, I think, some of the things that came up today and questions that we got in the public comment and send those around. If there are specific things, again, that you think a subcommittee should explore that came to you today that you didn't send in before, we'll include that in the survey.
Yes, and these charges can change over time, right? You can add more to it. So appreciate your feedback on that.
Yes. Sorry, you don't need to back up, I can read it to you. On the funding slide,
Back up.
sorry, Elizabeth Andrews, Metropolitan Center, Lewin Law School. Thank you, Matt. All right, the first objective seems pretty straightforward, develop a financing strategy, right? And who's it for? Totally get that. The third one was added in, identify methods to support local revenue. Get that. In the second one, recommending the process, the new added the red type. What are Virginia's specific desired outcomes seems bigger than the funding subcommittee. And it's going to require cross-pollination with somebody else. You know, it seems like that's something that's beyond just here are funding sources available. How do we parlay those? How do we combine those? What is the thought on that?
I think it's more on, if those are defined, how do we direct them? How do we achieve that through funding?
Okay.
How do we direct the use? And that is the common.
So once somebody else has determined Virginia's specific desired outcomes, how do we direct them to follow up? It's really kind of the question then.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out before we sign up and volunteer, you know, what is What is the universe?
We
of
just put it
design?
down for all of them. so.
Thank you, Director Wells. All right, thank you.
Troy Hartley, Virginia Sea Grant, building on Elizabeth's comment a little bit. Elizabeth, I think you're also speaking to, and I'm sure you guys are thinking about this, the roles and functions that we'll have on those subcommittees on these issues that will have cross-fertilization needs. If we're talking through criteria and weighting strategies in a research or data section that's dealing with something like equity or nature-based solutions, things that are still refining, that needs to feed back into prioritization and feed into funding. So you'll have an iterative component of the conversation you will want to.
Yeah, and I think the plan here would be to have subcommittees do regular report outs.
And then this group.
And this group, and that can kind of feed into that cross pollination.
I have a comment as well. Underfunding revenue streams, you see resilience revenue streams, these need to be all revenue streams, because there are existing state programs that have resilience benefit. And I'm thinking specifically DHCD programs, like block grant programs. I mean, those, if you ask the communities that are receiving those funds, those are resilience projects. They may not look like what we all think a resilience project looks like fixing a whole bunch of failed septic systems. Resilience project.
Director, well, just building on your answer there a bit, then backing up, sorry. Feels like, you probably thinking about this as you assign people to multiple subcommittees, there'll be some real time kind of iterative conversations that will be needed that coming back quarterly to share that may not catch it. So I'm just thinking out loud about the roles and responsibilities.
I think we to the degree that we can kind of encourage that and again, stay within all of our employee requirements and everything else. But I don't want to stovepipe it. So we didn't feel like this group is large enough that we need to break it up into not as many subcommittees as last time, but a couple. The other thoughts? Any other questions?
Includes the TAC update section of the agenda.
That is the end of the Matt Dallin show. Appreciate it as always. Again, appreciate him and the entire TCR team for putting this all together. All right, so next item is old business. I don't have any. Don't have any new business. Right now, I'll kind of leave it up if anything that TAC member wants to bring up at this point. Right, that takes us to public comment. Forward, is there anybody else on the list? There's none. All right, that moves to public comment. Okay, so per the TAC charter, we set 20 minutes aside for public comment. No speaker can speak for more than 5 minutes. Sorry. But
do the whole 20.
Mr. Ford, if you'll identify yourself.
Sure. Jay Ford with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I'll keep it really brief. I wasn't planning on making comments, obviously, but I did want to pick up on the conversation about equity in here today. I think Director Wells maybe hit my comment on the head with his remarks that the outreach and engagement plan is about who's not in the room. And to me, the flip way of looking at that is, why aren't they in the room? And why isn't there someone that represents their interest in the room? And so when we're talking about equity, it really seemed to be sort of a narrow definition today, and talking about, we make sure that each locality is represented. But when I think about equity, I'm thinking about environmental justice communities, communities that are going to rate low on a benefit cost analysis, and they're not going to be the pet project of any locality. And so who is in this room to help raise that concern and represent that point of view? I think it's really important that that perspective has a seat in this room in addition to the outreach and engagement plan. And so it's something I wanted to throw out to you, Mr. Director, as well as the general membership here. I think that is something that was identified in the outreach and engagement committee with the first TAC, and I don't know if it's really been addressed in our current membership here. And so it's food for thought. There's some certainly organizations that work directly with EJ communities around the state, and they would be able to offer some global perspective on those issues that might benefit the work of the TAC. So, thank you so much.
Anybody else? Make the sign up sheet? Anybody else?
No.
Okay. All right. We were very efficient today. And I think we had some very good discussion. This was a good session. I think we've got a lot to take away for next time. So again, we'll just solicit anyone that has suggested topics for future meetings. I think we've got, I think, DDOT in the hopper, but others that might have topics or folks that they want to think might be able to present to the TAC that would be beneficial. We welcome those again, along with other locations. We did this one again in Richmond just for convenience and scheduling sake, but it is our intention to not do all of these things in Richmond, so you've got alternate locations. Again, any reactions that you have to what we talked about today that you didn't share with the group, but that you want to share with the group, please do send those to, you can send them directly to Matt or the Flood Resilience email address. We do ask that you channel everything through the staff because of FOIA requirements. We do welcome continued feedback and input. And unless anyone else has anything for the good of the ordinance, next meeting will be Q1. And that's as far as we will. I do think to that point, we will try to schedule these out a bit further in advance as we go. I think functionally, a lot of the folks in this group are going to be pretty busy when they all show up in Richmond. So it'll likely be after session just from a function standpoint. We'll try to get that out well in advance, try to maybe schedule these things up.
Because Chief, what about moving into, might not be good up here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Mary Carson, Steph, Wellness Lodge. The question about timing, I think, is relevant for the discussion of the outreach plan. So how will that coincide with the schedule for public comment and then the creation of the framework? You said it's iterative, so will there be an opportunity for TAC members to respond in a forum like this where we can have discussion?
For the COAP, you mean?
Correct.
I think our intention with that is to have just a public comment period. And have folks send that in. We can talk about offline if you're good with it. We think they're good with that. Anybody else? Go once? Go twice? Very much appreciate everybody's time and your efforts in this. Thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.
So you can at least go to the website and look and see what's going on.